I wanted to bring you on to talk about the recent Democratic failure in the Senate to kind of get this voting rights bill across the line. It's interesting, right? Because it kind of comes on the heels of their failure with the Build Back Better. They made what I thought was a pretty large spectacle over bringing this voting rights bill to the floor. They of course did not do the same with Build Back Better. So I guess my first question for you is, why do you think that the Democrats decided to force the vote, so to speak, on the voting rights bill?
Well, I think that decision can really only be seen and should be seen in the context of the failure on Build Back Better. There was a very conscious decision that was made to shift messaging. In fact, this was, I think, pretty much explicitly how Democratic leaders themselves framed it. They wanted to shift messaging to this new priority, Build Back Better having failed, and of course, Build Back Better originally contained the majority of their, I mean, in some ways, the majority of their domestic policy agenda, certainly where most of the spending was contained. And ultimately, they couldn't even get the version of it that was less than a third of the original version. They couldn't seem to get it done, so they made a decision to shift to this issue of voting rights. And I think they did so in the full knowledge that they were not going to pass major voting rights legislation either. I think this
Mhm.
has to be understood as a messaging shift. The administration from the very beginning, I would argue, uh, has not made voting rights a priority, even though they are clearly in kind of terms of narrow self-interest. Um, or just simple political opportunism, voting rights should be a no-brainer for the Democrats, and they will struggle in future elections if they don't get these bills passed, even more than they're going to struggle already. But they've not made this a priority, and I think the shift has to be seen as more of a shift in rhetoric than a kind
Mhm.
of serious attempt to realign legislative priorities with a view to getting something passed.
Right, because it seems, at least to me, that there was never a chance that this bill would pass. Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema had indicated long before that they were not going to support any kind of filibuster reform, which was key to getting the bill over the finish line. So, it was doomed from the start in a way. And that leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about. You write a lot about Democrats and, I suppose, American liberals in general kind of invoking a perpetual state of emergency, but then offering very tepid, if any, solutions to that emergency, to that kind of ongoing crisis. And that got me thinking about how, in the lead up to the voting rights showdown on the Senate floor, you heard all kinds of Democratic politicians, from Joe Biden to Jamal Bowman, really invoking Jim Crow, right, and talking about how this voting rights bill is to not pass it would be just a danger to American democracy. And perhaps there is some, an element of truth to that. But then I was struck by the fact that after the bill did not pass, I don't know if you saw White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. She gave a conference she went on The View, I believe, and she said something like, if you're sad about the bill not passing, like, you could just this weekend go to kickboxing and have a margarita to just unwind from the stress of this bill not passing. And that weird disjunct between the it in my opinion, hyperinflated rhetoric about like the new Jim Crow, or, this being tantamount to Jim Crow. And then the weird, aftermath where we're talking about like just throw back a margarita. Like, I suppose the question for you is, what does this pomp and circumstance tell us about who exactly the Democrats were trying to reach or appeal to with this rhetoric?
I mean, I think anecdotally that example is a really good case study in the kind of rhetoric that we see from liberals, the broad church of American liberals today, and the broad church of Democrats we see today, from Jen Psaki over to the left with someone like Jamal Bowman. Um, I think it's a really good example of the balance of forces in the Democratic coalition and the type of rhetoric they ultimately produce, which, as you said, is this. Yeah, I think that's the right way to characterize it. This, on the one hand, this language of kind of that's suffused with moral urgency, and all the rest of it. Every election is the most important election of our lifetime. Michelle Obama, I think, said something to that effect a few weeks ago about the coming midterms. But then also there's this radical disavowal of responsibility, of accountability, and almost this at times this fantasy of political impotence, which I mean, I'm a broken record on it, but I think is captured beautifully is the wrong word, but in something like Aaron Sorkin's The West Wing, where, you know, that's the most wildest, it's the wildest, most unconstrained liberal fantasy you could find. And in a two-term Democratic presidency, there are no major domestic policy reforms that get passed. I mean, it's incredible. But you know, I think it's important to consider the background to this and what it is, the strange kind of configuration, the strange balance of forces that produces the contradictions you've just alluded to. I mean, in the case of something like voting rights, I mean, quite obviously, there's a history of, I mean, voter suppression has a deep history. You know, Ari Berman, who's a reporter over at Mother Jones, who I'm quite fond of and read a lot of, you know, he's documented this very well, as have many others. You know, the deep history of voter suppression, you know, and the kind of racialist history of voter suppression as well. So we shouldn't discount that. But you know, there's clearly a contradiction here in how it's being talked about, which is analogous to similar contradictions we saw throughout the Trump era, where one minute we'd hear that, you know, the Fourth Reich was coming to America, and then the next, Democratic politicians would be voting to approve Trump's, you know, judicial nominees or whatever.
Right.
You know, there are innumerable examples of this. So, what explains that contradiction? I mean, I think there are a number of reasons, but I think it's best to think of the Democratic Party as a kind of political platypus. It's something that consists of many ill-fitting parts. On the one hand, it's the party of liberally minded, progressive, and even left-wing voters. Historically, or at least since round about the 1930s, it's also tended to be the wing of America's political duopoly from which kind of popular reforms have sprung. Beginning especially in the 1990s, or accelerating the 1990s, we should say, it's also been the home of a broad coalition of big business, financial capital, health insurance companies, and also, and this is important, a right-leaning suburban constituency, which the party leadership has been very keen to court and elevate as kind of the central audience to which it's pitching. So
your kickboxers and margarita drinkers, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. The kickboxers and margaritas. I mean, Jen Psaki could not have been any more explicit in that quote you just mentioned. But so, you know, I think the Democratic Party is often referred to as kind of a broad church. That's how people think of it. And that's true in a sense, but it's not a broad church, I would argue, that really in the sense of accommodating different ideological perspectives or different political perspectives. A lot of the constituencies, and I would argue the ones that have the greatest deal of influence, are not really popular constituencies at all, or even groups that are, you know, activist coalitions, nonprofits, civil rights advocacy groups, whatever, that are seeking to represent the popular interest in some way. They are private interests. They're motivated by profit, and their goal is to capture political parties and to capture the legislative process. And with their very powerful lobbies and PR wings, and also, I think most importantly of all, their campaign donations, they tend to have the final say in many cases on what can or cannot get passed when either of the two parties is in power. So I think it's this, more than anything else, it's this kind of strange balance of forces that produces the type of rhetoric that we so often see from liberal politicians, where on the one hand, there's this kind of house lexicon of kind of the language of inclusion and you know, social justice, and even sometimes gesturing towards particular policy priorities. But then on the other hand, there's this kind of fantasy of impotence, this near total disavowal of any responsibility to run on an agenda and then pass it. And I think that's especially true when Democrats are in power. You just start to hear endlessly about how they can't pass anything, and there's nothing they can do, and that's not an accident.
So I think I want to just wrap up with this question of political priorities because I would agree that, or I think that probably most people watching agree that voting rights are very important, especially in the context of, as you were saying, the longer history of voter suppression in the U.S. Now that said, we do have some polls and surveys that actually show that a big part of the Democratic base, they're concerned about voting rights, but that isn't the thing that's driving them to the polls. So it was like kind of an odd thing for Democrats to kind of stake their claim on, I guess. But I suppose the question for you is, you know, though we all agree that voting rights are important and that we definitely need legislation of some kind to pass in the U.S., I'm wondering if you think that voting rights are sort of sufficient for progressive change, because that was very much the message that I heard coming out of the Democratic camp. And as socialists, we obviously want to expand democracy, but I just don't think it's just about voting rights. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at voting rights or something like voting rights in two ways. I mean, for one, I think they are worth. I mean, they're valuable intrinsically. Small d democracy, I think,
Mhm.
is an intrinsically important principle. Um, but you have to look at them another way too, which is you have to also see them as a means to an end. Civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King, always thought of voting rights as kind of the beginning of a process. Martin Luther King, when he spoke to the United States Senate in 1966, said it was easier to gain the right to vote because it didn't cost the nation anything.
Mhm.
And the fact is that we're dealing with issues now that will call for something of a restructuring of the architecture of American society. And that is going to cost the nation something. So I
Mhm.
think voting rights, without a political program attached to them that seeks to use democracy to expand, you know, to expand democracy into other spheres of life, and to pass a broadly popular agenda. Voting rights are clearly not sufficient on their own. And I really liked the piece David Sirota wrote about this last week, which I think was actually called "Voting Rights Alone Will Not Save the Democrats," and
Right.
where he pointed out, among other things, that the Democratic Party asks its voters to vote for it, and it asks them to do so so that they can solve the problems that are created by the people who donate to the Democratic Party,
Right.
who it simultaneously promises to enrich. So unless voting rights are part of a broader agenda to break fundamentally and irreversibly from that model of politics, they're kind of just rhetoric and they're kind of just messaging. And unfortunately, despite all the language we've heard from liberal leaders at the moment and from Democrats, that's in this moment what they are.
Well, Luke, thank you for your time. Before we let you go, do you want to say just a few words about your new book that's coming out? The Dead Center, again, great title.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it will obviously touch on and cover a lot of the things we've talked about today, but also a lot of other things as well. It tries to be, I think, an expansive argument about our current political moment, everything that is strange and unique and frustrating about it, as well. So, in addition to uh, lots of essays about prominent Democrats and why they're bad in particularly niche kind of ways. There are also essays on neoliberalism, on the American media and how the punditocracy works, postmodernism, all kinds of fun stuff. So I hope people will check it out.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.